Welcome back to the channel. As promised last week after we reviewed the Bally Astrocade, this week we're going to review the Fairchild Channel F, which is short for Channel Fun. It was a video game console. It was actually the first to be based on a microprocessor and to use ROM cartridges instead of having games built in. It was released by Fairchild Cameron Instrument in November 1976 across North America. I believe the original retail price was $169.95, which should be equivalent to about $900 in 2023. It was launched as the video entertainment system, but if you remember, Atari was released the following year as the video computer system. So at that point, Fairchild rebranded their machine as the Channel F, while also keeping the video entertainment system descriptor. It lasted from 1976 up until 1983, when the video game crash occurred. It initially sold about 350,000 units as of 1979. The CPU was actually unique. It was a chip that was actually manufactured by Fairchild, and it was called the Fairchild F8. Now the memory, and you have to remember what decade this was made, was 64 bytes of RAM. That's not kilobytes, that's not megabytes, that's 64 bytes of RAM. And there was a 2 kilobyte video buffer. And the controller input were joystick that functioned as both a joystick and a digital paddle. I'll explain very shortly. There was a second release of the game system, and that had a joystick called a jet stick that had an added fire button. Now Fairchild, like I just said, sold about 350,000 units before 1979. But when the Atari came out, even though Fairchild came out first and beat Atari to the punch, Atari soon took over the market with video cartridges that they were releasing. Their games were much more detailed and more interactive, and Fairchild sold the technology to Zircon International in 1979. The Channel F System 2 basically occurred from Zircon, and they released the System 2, and the changes were basically that the controllers were now removable. So on this system, you can see that the joysticks are hardwired. On Channel 2, or System 2, I should say, the joysticks used an Atari port and were removable. But they were not compatible with Atari joysticks, but they did use the identical port technology. In addition, the sound was removed from inside the system. So this is a System 1, and this has a built-in internal speaker with a set volume. In the System 2, the volume and sound was routed through the RF connection to the TV, and you could control the volume on your TV. They were also able to simplify the electronics, and they used 2 custom logic chips replacing the standard TTL logic chips. So this resulted in a much smaller motherboard, which allowed for a smaller, simpler, more modern looking case design. A number of licensed versions were released in Europe, including the Luxor Video Entertainment System in Sweden and the Admin Grandstand Video Entertainment Computer in the UK. There was also the Dumont Video Play and the Emerson Video Play that were released in Italy and Belgium. Here I have some of the literature that came with the system. This was the owner's manual that would have come with the system in the box, and I was lucky enough to find one in the wild. And it basically kind of, the typical, gives you some congratulations, but the thing that I found most striking was it goes through step by step how to insert a cartridge and turn on the system. And I think for most of us from Generation X, we take it for granted that um, you insert a cartridge and then you turn on a system. You don't pull the cartridge out while the system's on. And literally, this had to be explained in the instructions. And you can see it goes through step by step inserting and removing the video cards. One feature that was kind of unique to this system was that it actually had a pause button or a hold button where you could pause gameplay, which was, again, this was another first. So they were the first with a ROM cartridge system and a first with these type of unique controllers that eventually the Bally Astrocade copied, more or less. And it was the first to have a pause or a hold button. The controllers are a joystick without a base, and the main body is a large hand grip with a triangular cap on top. And you could use the joystick as both a joystick and a paddle. And not only could it be pushed down to operate, and I'll show you. So you had action where it could be pushed down, you could turn it left or right, and then you could push it forward, left, right, or back. There was no fire button on the joystick other than pushing down on the top. But later, when you had removable joysticks, they released the jet stick that did have a separate fire button. In addition, in the original owner's manual, it gave you a little bit more about starting the video play. There were two built-in games, and those were hockey and tennis, so those did not require a cartridge. And you could also reset the system with the reset button. So there's on the unit 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the panel, and hockey was game 1 and tennis was game 2. And hopefully the video clears up a little bit with the focus. In addition, on the back of the system, there is steps for maintaining your video game system. They did have a warranty card that you could mail in, and they had a newsletter that they mailed out with updates. On the display now is actually one of those inserts that would be mailed out, and this would show the current cartridges released by Fairchild. And you can kind of see from the graphics on there, they're very primitive compared with the Atari 2600. But they did actually have a multitude of cartridges when the system was released. There were 27 cartridges total termed video carts were officially released in the United States during the ownership of both Fairchild and Zircon. The first 21 of the 27 were actually released by Fairchild, and several of the cartridges are capable of playing more than one game. The typical price was about $19.95. That would be equivalent to about $100 in 2023. The video carts came in a box, and I'm fortunate enough to have the bowling game, which is, you can see Video Cart 21, and that's basically how it came, with some basic instructions. The one thing that I was impressed with is that it actually shows the graphics on the back of the box. Atari 2600 had larger boxes and they had artwork on the front, but initially they didn't have gameplay on the back of a lot of their cartridges, so you really didn't know what you were getting. The video carts were yellow, and if you notice, if you're from my generation, you can see they resemble 8-track tapes. They're almost the size of an 8-track tape. They're slightly smaller, so they won't fit in your 8-track player, and you can't put an 8-track cartridge in the Fairchild Channel F. I did check it out to try, though, just to see. The labels on the cartridges had typically some pretty colorful artwork on the front, and then they would display if there was more than one game. So you can see on this one, Maze, Jailbreak, Blind Man's Bluff, and Trailblazer on this is Video Cart 10. And so you could get 4 games in one cartridge. There was a sales brochure in 1978 that listed keyboard video carts for sale, but as of this time, no one has ever seen a keyboard for the Fairchild Channel F. So up on the screen, I have Video Cart 9. It's like actually one of my favorite games, and it's drag racing. The Channel F, like its reception in the video game community, which was basically started with this system and the Atari 2600. The Channel F had beaten the Atari VCS to the market, but once Atari was released, the sales of the Channel F fell. Interference, and all you have to do is hit the reset button, and I'll pull that game back up in a minute. Most of the Channel F titles were slow-paced, educational, and intellectual games that you could see from that pamphlet that they mailed out. And even with the redesigned Channel F2 in 1978, the Fairchild Company was unable to match the sales that the Atari 2600 achieved. And as far as we know from tracking, again, 350,000 units were sold by 1979 when they sold to Zircon, which I think that's pretty impressive for a new technology. Literally the first 2 years of sale and development. In 1983, after Zircon announced its discontinuation of the Channel F, Video Games Magazine reviewed the console, and it basically called it the system that nobody knows. It described its graphics and sounds as somewhat primitive by today's standards, and by that they meant at that point you had the Atari 2600, you had the Intellivision, ColecoVision was brand new on the market, and with each of those systems the graphics and the processors advanced. So I have the drag racing back up, and you just basically push the cartridge forward and it allows you to go and to move through the field. And there were 2 competing vehicles, and you could play against the computer, or you could play against one of your opponents, but it was limited to 2 people. And like I said, you can kind of see it can be a fun game, but the graphics are very primitive. Granted, this was a breakthrough system, first in many achievements, but they just really didn't develop the
technology, the graphics. They didn't have the talent that Atari was able to recruit, and didn't have a team that was, I think, creative enough, like the programmers that Atari had. And that's basically all that I have this week. Next week we will look at the Emerson Arcade. It's also called the Emerson Arcade 2001. And after that, we're going to start previewing the Atari 2600. And I have multiple rare accessories for that system. A few are limited editions with fewer than 200 known to be in existence at this time. So I think it should be a lot of fun. I enjoy sharing this stuff with you guys.